Well, hello. My name is Joe Scarbrough. I am the Director of Performing Arts at Skycrest United Methodist Church, and I am looking forward to this evening's community discussion on race. This is part of a month-long series that we are doing in conjunction with our musical Ragtime, and in a conjunction with a larger theme of social justice and reform. I wish I could be there in person. Right now, I am in Tennessee, dealing with a slight family um, situation, and I think it's actually quite fitting that I am here in Tennessee because of the history of the community that I was just visiting. Um, my uncle passed away recently and is from a small, very rural town here in West Tennessee. And we just happened to be there today. And I saw a lot of things today that are similar to the themes that we're going to discuss tonight and the themes in the musical Ragtime as a whole. So, those of you that are with us online or in person, at the end, we're going to have some discussion time where I am more than happy to answer any questions that I can. But basically, tonight, what we're going to do is talk about some of the themes and symbolism in the musical Ragtime. I want to quickly give you some terms that you're going to need to know here. When we talk about musicals, right, these are staged productions, usually with costumes, dancing, choreography, dialogue, actors. So when we talk about musicals, there are many levels of people who help create a musical. You have what we call the lyricist, who writes the lyrics to the songs. You have the composer who writes the music. Sometimes those people are the same, and sometimes it's a team working together. But then you also, and this is the confusing part, you also have someone who is called the book writer. Okay, this is the person that actually writes the script and the dialogue of the music. With this show, Ragtime, the trick is, and the reason it gets a little bit more confusing is because it's already based on a novel. So we have a novel that was written in 1974 by E.L. Doctorow, and then we have a musical that was written in 1996, where the book part of the musical, or the script, was written by Terrence McNally, and the music was written by Stephen Flaherty, and the lyrics were written by Lynn Ahrens. Now, Flaherty and Ahrens did a lot of work together on lots of different musicals, and so they were an already established team. Terrence McNally wrote the script for them as they composed and wrote the words to this music. So, why Ragtime? What is Ragtime? What is this musical about, and how does it relate to today? Well, Ragtime, as many of you probably know, is a style of music. And what makes Ragtime so interesting to me is that it was the first style of music formed in African American communities, former enslaved communities. And it is the first style of music from those communities that became mainstream in white culture. There are a couple of reasons for this. One of the main reasons is that the formerly enslaved people were using Western European-based instruments and tonal systems in order to make ragtime music, okay? So whereas during the enslavement time, African Americans didn't really have access to formal music lessons or formal music instruments. You had a lot of call and response singing, a lot of a cappella singing, which is where we get the American spiritual from. With ragtime in the late 1800s, we're now starting to see these formerly enslaved people getting more formal education as well as creating their own music without formal education. They're using instruments like pianos, like trombones and trumpets, and they're starting to form something based loosely on marches. You know, this is like the height of patriotism, the late 1800s, post-Civil War, Reconstruction. John Philip Sousa is around at this time, and we have this merge into the early 1900s, right? And so they're using these more traditional instruments in order to make music that is traditionally African American. Ragtime gives way to other styles of music, gives way to blues, gives way to jazz, gives way to swing. Okay, so ragtime is kind of like the grandfather of all of that. It's where it began. And a lot of times, what we forget is that ragtime. We always think of the entertainer and Scott Joplin, right? Scott Joplin was probably, arguably, the most famous ragtime composer, and he is a household name. And I think it's interesting that many of us don't realize until we look up a picture of Scott Joplin that he was a black guy. And to me, that's mind boggling that he's a household name. Nobody really talks about that part of it, that he was from a formerly enslaved family. And he lived in Missouri. So I think that's that's fascinating to me. And then you have so we have ragtime, the style of music. What made it appealing to white culture and why it was so accepted was, like I was saying, because the African Americans were starting to use tonalities, music, instruments that were familiar to white culture. Okay, and that was their foot in the door. And so we see the development of people like W.C. Handy. We see the development of Jim Europe, who is actually mentioned in the show Ragtime. He is briefly mentioned. And so through the means of creating a music that will be more pleasing and more whitewashed for a white culture, now we have formerly enslaved people, we have African Americans, we have people of color in general who are starting to get to perform in these white establishments, where before you couldn't have even gone in as a performer. Okay, now you're there as a performer. You still can't be a patron, right? But you can be a performer now. So although it was a small win, I do count it as a win nonetheless. So much like you have those early composers like Scott Joplin, like W.C. Handy, and like Jim Europe, who are people of color that are writing music for people of color, but so that it can be an inroad into advancement, justice, equality, right? We have people like Terrence McNally, Stephen Flaherty, and Lynn Ahrens, and E.L. Doctorow. So E.L. Doctorow wrote the original novel. The novel was written in 1974. The story he chose to write is set in the early 1900s, 1910 or so, or thereabouts. He sets it in the time that ragtime was in its heyday, and he weaves in fictional characters, like we're going to talk about in just a moment, along with historical figures who actually existed and who actually had an impact on civil rights, women's rights, workers' rights, immigrant rights. So we have this historical fiction novel that takes quite a bit of liberties, I must say. It's a little... Don't write a history report on it. But we have this novel now that E.L. Doctorow writes as a white man. And here's the thing. The novel is set in New Rochelle, New York, which is a real place. And it is actually where E.L. Doctorow grew up. He is writing about a New York town just north of New York City that is having problems in the 1970s. He is seeing these problems with systemic racism in New Rochelle, New York. Now, to those of us born and raised in the South, we're taught the South is racist. The North is not. The Civil War, for example. When E.L. Doctorow in his novel is saying, no, really, like, racism is happening up here in New Rochelle, you know? So in the novel itself, one of the biggest themes is that New Rochelle is a sheltered white community. At the very beginning of the show, during the introduction, the New Rochelle ensemble is singing, "There were gazebos and there were no Negroes," as in New Rochelle, there weren't any Negroes. Then a few minutes later in the song, they say, "There were no Negroes and there were no immigrants." Now, E.L. Doctorow is saying things like this, and then eventually Lynn Ahrens wrote the lyrics that match that theme, because it is ludicrous. It is ridiculous, right? That is such a silly idea, because obviously there are black people in New Rochelle. They're just ignored. Obviously there are immigrants. They're just ignored, right? And so that is a major theme that E.L. Doctorow was trying to bring to the forefront. So he's writing this novel that's set in 1910. He's writing it in 1974. It gets turned into a musical in 1996, and here we are performing it in 2021. And the same themes that were there when E.L. Doctorow felt compelled to write it the first time are still themes in our society and our culture today, that we feel the need to tell this story again and again through professional theaters, community theaters, all sorts of productions. So E.L. Doctorow, as a white man growing up in New Rochelle, New York, sees this racism and says, okay, what can I do about it? How can I affect change? And so he begins writing, and he's published many novels. He has an interesting writing style, but he wrote Ragtime as a historical fiction novel, tying together many real people. One of the storylines that we get into in the novel and in the musical is about Evelyn Nesbit, who is quote-unquote the Harlot of Babylon. She was a vaudeville performer who married an eccentric millionaire, Harry K. Thaw. Okay, Harry K. Thaw was a little crazy, most likely. She also was having an affair with Stanford White, who designed the Pennsylvania station, the original one, not the one you would visit today if you went to New York, but the original one. He also designed the Madison Square Garden, the original one. You wouldn't, if you looked up a picture of Madison Square Garden from 1910, you would not recognize it as the Madison Square Garden today. But here's the thing. When Harry Thaw found out about their affair, Evelyn Nesbit and Stanford White, when he found out about the affair, he went to a private party at Madison Square Garden, and in front of everyone, he shot and killed Stanford White. And he got away with it, basically. He was convicted, right? But he found not guilty due to mental, temporary insanity or whatnot. So he was in prison, of course, or he was in a mental hospital thereafter. But still, he killed somebody in broad daylight, point blank, in front of everyone. Okay? So put a little star on that and hold it over. We have, along with this, the story of Coalhouse Walker Jr., who is a black man in Harlem. And his girlfriend, they're not really married yet, or they're not engaged yet. So his girlfriend, Sarah, is staying with a family in New Rochelle. They had a bad falling out. I don't want to give away too much. So Coalhouse gets his car destroyed by some racist bigots in New Rochelle. And he's trying to get justice for that car. Okay, he worked very hard, saved up his money, bought himself a Model T, and it gets destroyed, right? And it doesn't just get destroyed. It gets vandalized and destroyed. And it is insulting. It is embarrassing to him. No one will help him. No one will do anything. So Sarah tries to get justice, to help him get justice, by taking her case to a traveling politician. Okay? Well, that gets misconstrued. And when she's trying to get the politician's attention, other people think that she's trying to attack the politician. So later in the show, the Coalhouse is saying, I still want justice. I still want justice, and nobody's giving him justice. And I think that one of the reasons E.L. Doctorow chose the Evelyn Nesbit story, along with Coalhouse's fictional story, is to show that, as the song says, justice can be so unfair. Because here, Stanford White got justice immediately for his murder. Somebody killed Stanford White. That person's now in a mental institution. He didn't get the death penalty, of course. He didn't get prison, but he did get something. Whereas with Coalhouse and his story arc, he never gets justice, ever. Now, I'm trying to tell you this without spoiling what's happening in the show, but I do think that there's a correlation there for why those two stories were chosen as the criminal aspects of the musical. Those are really the only two crimes that have happened, is Evelyn Nesbit and the destruction of the car that led to other things. Okay? So I think E.L. Doctorow was trying to use that historical trial, that historical moment, to show that level of injustice and inequality. He uses the character of Booker T. Washington in here, and talks about how Booker T. Washington was a pivotal figure in the cause of equality and ending racial tensions, right? And although he wasn't completely successful during his own lifetime, he definitely laid that foundation for those men and women who followed in his footsteps to try to elevate the cause of black people who have been mistreated. Excuse me. It's very cold up here, and my sinuses are getting the better of me. So E.L. Doctorow writes these historical figures in. He uses Harry Houdini and Emma Goldman as two portrayals of immigrants that go along with the Tata character. Tata is a word that means father in many Eastern European cultures. So Tata is an Eastern European immigrant who comes over to America. And so to line up with that story arc, we have Emma Goldman, who was an immigrant and an anarchist, for lack of better terms. I would say that she basically wanted a communist society in America, or at least a socialist society. And Harry Houdini, who was also an immigrant. He was a Hungarian immigrant. So we have these immigrants that are all talking and trying to find their way to the top. We have Harry Houdini, who was successful. He did accomplish what he set out to do. And we have Emma Goldman, who gets deported, arrested many times, and eventually deported because she was trying to speak truth to power. Now, we may not agree with her politics, but it is fair to say that without the work of Emma Goldman and without the work of those supporting her, that the labor rights movement, the women's rights movement, wouldn't have had as much of a push, right? So E.L. Doctorow uses those two real people to push along Tata's storyline. One of my favorite lines in the show comes towards the beginning. The father character in the white New Rochelle family, is leaving on an expedition with Admiral Perry. Admiral Perry was a real person. He actually did discover the North Pole. His first mate's name was actually Matthew Henson, and Matthew Henson was or at least came from a family of formerly enslaved people. That was groundbreaking. For Matthew Perry, for Admiral Perry to have a black first officer was groundbreaking. So Father and Admiral Perry are off to find the North Pole on a ship leaving New York. Tata and his daughter are coming from Europe on a ship. And those ships are passing in the darkness, and that's part of the song, passing in the darkness, and they see each other across the water. And Father says, you're brave, whoever you are, coming so far, expecting so much. And then Father has this line that he says, you're basically too late. Are you looking for freedom? Are you looking for love? Too late. That is gone. And it just happens, that line happens really quickly. It just flies by. But then later in the show, Tata, when he finally gets to America, and he realizes that he's stuck in these tenements, these disgusting, filthy, smelly tenements with his daughter. They don't have enough to eat. They don't have heating. They don't have fresh water or food. It's sickening, right? Tata gets angry. This is not why he fled Eastern Europe. He fled Eastern Europe for the promise of a better life. So eventually Tata leaves the city, and he is able to do something with his life. And he is able to climb the ladder and to do something out of his own ingenuity. So we have the story of Coalhouse, we have the story of Tata, then we have the story of Mother. And Mother and Father are the New Rochelle family. They are a white, upper class family in New Rochelle, New York. Mother's younger brother lives with them. Mother's father, usually it's Mother's father, the grandfather character. For our production, we're having to have a grandmother, and she's wonderful. So if you know any older men who like to do community theater, please send them our way because we always need them in community theater. But our grandmother is a wonderful actress, and I'm looking forward to her representation of this character. So in the house in New Rochelle, you have Mother and Father, you've got Mother's younger brother, and Mother's mother, grandmother in our case. You also have the little boy who is Mother and Father's child. So Father leaves. Father owns a fireworks company, and the Mother's younger brother works in the fireworks company. And so Father leads on this expedition with Admiral Perry. Somebody's got to watch the business, so Mother does. And this, too, is kind of controversial because a woman's place, and it's even referenced here, a woman's place is at home. And Mother says, well, then if that's how it should be, then your father should have stayed here. Okay, because things have to get done. Things have to be attended to. The younger brother isn't really the best for reliability. And the little boy is 10. He can't run a fireworks company, so the mother does. And through that journey of starting to run this fireworks company, traveling outside of New Rochelle to conduct business, she starts realizing that there's more out there than her sheltered, safe life has led her to believe. As she sings this whole song, it's part of that same song I was referencing earlier, about the women who have these brave ambitions, and then they marry in the safest way possible. They're sheltered, they're safe for the rest of their life, they're provided for. So we have the mother storyline that actually kind of lines up with the Emma Goldman storyline as well, with the women's rights, where Emma Goldman does not let any male figure push her aside or push her down. She is constantly living her own life independently, even though she was married. She is living her own life independently. And so we have a woman like Emma Goldman and a woman like Mother, who up until this point had only lived to serve her husband. And now, with her husband gone, she gets this awakening where she starts to have her own thoughts and opinions, where she starts to act on her own thoughts and opinions, which again is controversial when Father returned from his expedition. So with each of these artificial, fictional storylines, Coalhouse and Sarah, Tata and his daughter, and the family, the white family from New Rochelle, with each of these fictional storylines, we have true characters that kind of spawn off from them, okay? And they're telling their own stories using their own themes. One reason I think that this is very important is because in order for a show and a novel like this to be successful in the 1970s, now keep in mind that E.L. Doctorow was writing in the 1970s. He may have been alive during, well, he definitely was alive during desegregation. He may have been alive at the beginning of the Jim Crow era. His parents were definitely alive during the Reconstruction era, okay? So he is seeing these injustices. He is wondering what he can do about that as a white man. He begins to write this novel. Here's the thing. He was trying to help. He really was trying to help. And the way he was trying to help was from within the white community. Like it or not, we like things that are familiar to us more than we like things that are new or different. Okay? It's usually the case. That's why, for example, that's why I've never actually been to a synagogue or a mosque, because I have no idea how to act in a synagogue or a mosque. Now, if I knew a Jewish person or a Muslim person who invited me and they could kind of prep me for it, I would feel more comfortable. Is that wrong of me? Maybe. I should probably be brave enough to go to a mosque or a synagogue out of a respectful place in my mind and in my heart. E.L. Doctorow is thinking the same thing. We need to tell people about these injustices that happened in the 1910s because they're still happening now. We are right on the heels of the Civil Rights Act when he's writing this novel. Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, Reconstruction after the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Act. None of these things changed things overnight. As a matter of fact, a lot of these things are still in existence today. A lot of these Jim Crow straggling philosophies are still in effect today. So E.L. Doctorow is trying to say, hey, there's this pivotal moment in the early 1900s with the rise of the KKK especially, that is still being perpetuated in our modern society. This is not right, and I must do something about it. But the people that need to hear it aren't going to listen unless it comes from someone who can speak their language, someone who can whitewash it the way they need to hear it. Was this story as forward-thinking as it could have been? Absolutely not. Did he water down some of the details? Sure. But for what he did, he brought this story to the masses and won multiple awards with that novel because of it. Okay? And this was the 70s. This was the 70s. In the South, the 60s and 70s were rough for people of color, for immigrants. They still are, kind of. So now you fast forward to 1996, when the musical is in development. And you think, okay, why? Why take a musical? Why write a musical based on a novel from the 1970s that is based on characters from the 1910s if that novel and its upcoming musical aren't still relevant to the 1990s culture and mentality? And these three, this team of three, Terrence McNally, Stephen Flaherty, and Lynn Ahrens, got together and said, this is a story we need to tell. Terrence McNally actually spent lots of his childhood and young adulthood in St. Petersburg before moving to New York. He pretty much grew up here in St. Pete. And unfortunately, he actually passed away in Sarasota about a year ago. He passed away in March of 2020 from COVID-19. So this musical has a direct tie to the St. Pete, Greater Tampa Bay region just because of Terrence McNally himself, who is the one who wrote the script and passed away last year. So Flaherty and Ahrens take the book that the script that Terrence McNally wrote, and they begin crafting these beautiful lyrics and this amazing music. He voices it for the composer, Stephen Flaherty, voices it for a full orchestra, a full symphonic orchestra. We have strings, we have brass, we have woodwinds, we have a full percussion battery, everything you can think of. Why? Why? Why not do it for a brass band? Why not do it for a ragtime piano? Because again, the point is the people who need to hear the story will only go and listen to the story if it is something that is familiar to them. So by going to Broadway and seeing an orchestra, this orchestra is the same, almost exact voicing as the Phantom of the Opera orchestra. Okay, so you can see why upper-class people are going to say, ooh, it's a full orchestra. I want to go to the symphony. I want to go to the orchestra. They're going to go. What are they going to, and they're going to see the name Ragtime. They probably don't know much about the story. They're going to see the name Ragtime. What are they going to learn? Ah, it's kind of like a sleight of hand, if you will, where we take something that is written by a bunch of white people with a musical style that everyone's familiar with an orchestra in a Broadway theater, a safe environment, because that's the way we're going to get people in the door, to give them the lesson they need to hear, to give them the story they need to understand, to try to curb those actions that many of them are perpetuating, that they don't even know it. So we have in the musical, we have an abridged version of the novel with all of these same characters um, that are trying to live their best life in a society that doesn't want them to live their best life. We see the Tata character later in the show who has become a movie director, quite by chance, actually. He starts off making silhouettes, with the black paper, and you cut out the person's face, and it's a silhouette. He puts them into He puts them into a book that you can flick through, and the silhouettes move like an early animation. Then he takes that and turns it into a projector, making silent films. So we can see step by step how he is improving his life and the life of his daughter. But in order to do that, he has to take on a new name so that he can be taken seriously. No one's going to listen to a poor immigrant, but they will listen to someone with the title of Baron. So even though he is not a baron, he takes on that title because the only way into these societies is to make them feel comfortable and familiar by giving them something they're used to. And what do people in power hate? Is someone higher power that they don't know, that they're not in the same circles with. There's a baron here in America and I don't know him. Oh my goodness, I need to know him. I need to invest in his business because he is a baron, right? So Tata takes that step by step by step. He becomes successful and successful until he is able to provide for himself and his daughter, right? Coalhouse, in many ways, his storyline, to me, parallels the issues that we have been facing over the last few years, that we've frankly been facing a lot longer than that, but that have come to light more in the past few years with brutality towards people of color. We've all seen the photos from the 1950s of black people being sprayed with fire hoses and attacked by canine dogs outside of lunch counters. We've all seen and heard of Bloody Sunday. We've all seen and heard Edmund Pettus Bridge. We've all seen and heard Dr. Martin Luther King's speech. We see it in a veil of black and white, TV, old newsreels, without realizing that for me, people in my age, I'm 33, my parents lived through it. I am in the city where my mother went to high school. And little did I know, and it breaks my heart to say this, but my grandparents moved to a new neighborhood to avoid integration while my mom was in school. This is not far removed history. This is recent, modern history. This has been less than 100 years. Most of the people that we know that are older than 50, everyone we know that is older than 50, remembers this, was affected by this. Some for the good, some for the bad. Some people were on the wrong side and had a change of heart and came to the right side. Okay, some people were on the right side from the beginning, some people are still on the wrong side of these types of conversations. But if we don't have the conversations, no one's heart can be changed. And when those people do have a change of heart, we have to accept that. We have to embrace that person's change of heart instead of harping on the actions that they did. We have to look at the actions that they're trying to do now. So the Coalhouse storyline is one that parallels too closely with current events, with recent events. When someone is killed, we're going to take the example of Breonna Taylor. There is a woman who is asleep in her own apartment, and police come in and kill her. Doesn't matter to me that they were looking for her boyfriend and not for her. Doesn't matter if they had a warrant, if they didn't, if whatever not. To me, that doesn't matter. What matters is someone with a weapon came into the home of someone without a weapon. Someone without a weapon was sleeping in their own bed, and they wouldn't wake up again. Now, when you have a system in place that does not provide justice for the family of someone who is shot in their bed asleep, when you have a system in place that does not provide them justice, okay, that's bad. And if it happens once, we might say, okay, that was a fluke. But if it keeps happening over and over and over, where unarmed people are being shot by people in authority, and those people in authority are the ones that those victims need to go to get justice, this is a cyclical conversation that is going to keep happening and happening forever if we don't do something to change it. So then we have all of these victims of brutality who have no one to complain to except the people that are brutalizing them. Those are the people that are supposed to provide law and order, justice for all. But every complaint is denied. That's one of the lines in the show. Coalhouse goes from bureaucrat to lawyers to judges. Every complaint is denied. We are seeing that right now. This musical, set in 1910, novel in 1974, musical in 1996, and this stuff is still happening in our own backyard. Okay? So, when these things are happening, just like in the musical, people become desperate for justice. People need that justice. At least they need to be heard. Now, Coalhouse does some bad stuff. There's no way around that. The taking of a life is never justified. I do not believe that it is ever justified. And I believe that if somebody is going to take the life of somebody else, then that person needs to own up and accept the consequence of their actions, no matter why they did it. They need to own up to it. They need to fess up to it. They need to confess and take their punishment as it is prescribed to them. And that's what the real character of Booker T. Washington tries to instill on the fake character of Coalhouse, and says, you know, think of your son. Think of the legacy you're going to leave him if you don't admit what you've done. Yes, all of these events led up to you doing that, but that doesn't make what you did right. So Booker T. Washington's character finally gets through to Coalhouse. And I'm going to see if I can find this really quick, because it's really my favorite song in the whole show. Because I think a lot of times what we forget is when we have been brutalized, whether it is for the race we are, whether it's for our religion, whether it's for our sexuality, when we have been bullied, when we have been killed, or people in our community have been killed, we get angry when no one does anything about it. It hurts. It sickens us. When Pulse nightclub happened, it sickened me. Hearing about gay people being dragged to death, tied up to the back of a truck, sickens me. And we don't talk about it. We lock it away because, that's taboo. We can't talk about that. And it's not. It's not. This stuff is still happening. And so we get angry, and sometimes, just like everyone else, we act out of anger instead of out of hope and compassion, because it is so hard to show hope and compassion to those people who are actively trying to kill you and the people in your community. So Coalhouse, once he finally changes his mind and backs away from the cliff that he's about to jump, again, no spoilers, he backs away from the cliff he's about to jump off of that would have been really bad, the point of no return bad. He backs away from this cliff, and he tells the people that are with him, his group of friends that are there supporting him, these are the words: "Go out and tell our story and let it echo far and wide. Make them hear you. How justice was our battle and how justice was denied. Make them hear you. And say to those who blame us for the way we chose to fight that sometimes there are battles that are more than black and white. And I could not put down my sword when justice was my right. Make them hear you. Go out and tell the story to your daughters and your sons. Tell them in our struggle we were not the only ones. Your sword can be a sermon. This is my favorite part. Your sword can be a sermon, or the power of the pen. Teach every child to raise his voice, and then, my brothers, then will justice be demanded by 10 million righteous men. Make them hear you. When they hear you, I will be near you again. That's Kohlhaas at the end there saying, when people finally hear, finally listen, when they finally hear, then Kohlhaas will be there again in spirit. This is such a powerful song that he's singing because he is on the precipice of doing something terrible. He gets talked down from that, and he says that the sword or your defense mechanism can be a sermon. And we think of Dr. Martin Luther King, or the power of the pen. We think of Maya Angelou, W.E.B. Du Bois, any of these pivotal figures. Teach every child to raise his voice. Every child, not just a marginalized child, but every child. Teach every child to raise his voice. If we start instilling equality and love and acceptance to our children, they will only perpetuate love and equality and acceptance as they grow up and to their children. That's how it has to happen. Teach every child to raise his voice, and then will justice be demanded by 10 million righteous men. That's how it has to happen. So we're going to be telling this story because it needs to be told. It is a story that has not changed much. And we have to look inside and say, why not? We have to ask ourselves those tough questions. How many times have we seen or heard jokes about immigrants, jokes about Mexicans or Puerto Ricans, or jokes about black people, jokes about women? How many times do we see things or hear things that make us cringe inside and we don't do anything about it? We keep our mouths shut. When we do that, are we not then perpetuating that same culture? Are we not, by allowing it to happen, are we not assisting it to happen? So we're going to be telling this story because we need to. We need to think. We need to ask ourselves these tough questions of what should I do? What would I do? Mother in the show basically takes a single black woman who has had a child. She takes Sarah and the baby into their home to care for as if they were her own flesh and blood. And she says, one line in the show at the very end, she says, "No one will ever do enough for this child." When should we be mother? When should we be like mother in this show and say no one will ever do enough to end violence, to end racism, to end homophobia, sexism, xenophobia? When do we take that stance that mother took and say, bring them inside? Bring them inside our hearts, bring them inside our places of worship, bring them inside our homes, because they have been ostracized enough. They have been mistreated enough. And that is not how we want to live. The show is going to be using some terrible words that I've heard my own father speak. And I've heard of people that get offended by hearing the words in the show. I hear of white people that get offended by hearing these words. And we debated long and hard about whether or not we were going to censor the show, because a lot of people get offended by this word, until we thought long and hard about the fact that there are people that live with being called this word on a daily basis. They don't get to escape it. It is a part of their life. It is something that disgusting, vile people use to attack them. And we have the gall to be offended when we hear it, even though it's not directed at us. So we decided to keep all of the language in the show, like we're supposed to anyway. We decided to keep it in the show. We want people to feel uncomfortable. We want people to have that moment of shock when they hear the type of vitriol spewed by some of these characters. If you don't like it, don't do it. Don't perpetuate it. Don't let that person next to you make a racist joke. Stop it. But we had to keep that language in there. We just had to, for that shock moment of just disgust. And that's what we want you to feel when you hear the words. So I hope you come out and see the show. You can either drive in and watch it on a big movie screen, or you can watch it from the comfort of your own home. We have a truly remarkable cast that is going to be performing this with some of the most phenomenal voices I have ever heard. Everyone is volunteering their times and talent. We have an orchestra that's going to be performing as well, and it's going to be the story that we all need to hear. Through the coming weeks, we're going to have more of these discussions led by different leaders, and after each of our performances, we are going to have a time where the audience can interact with the cast and ask them questions. How did they enjoy performing? What were some of the struggles they went through? How does it parallel to their own lives? And so we want this to be a holistic event that is not just come out and watch a musical, but rather come out, watch a musical, try to find out why it was written, and try to find out what lessons can be taken. All right, I'm not really sure. I don't see anybody here. I'm not like on Facebook Live. I'm used to doing these kind of things on Facebook Live where I can read comments and things. So I will gladly jump on Facebook Live if that would help. If anybody would like to ask questions, if you would like to come and see the show, you can definitely send an email to office@skycrest.net. Or you can head on over to www.skycrest.net/ragtime, and you can get all of your information right there. All right. I'm not sure if I have the ability to take any questions here or not, because I can't see anything that comes through. So I would just say that for now, we're going to go ahead and end this. And if there are any questions on the Facebook, I will go and answer them. So write them in the comments, and I will jump over there if there are any questions or comments, and I will have a discussion there with you guys. So thanks so much. We hope to see you the last 2 weekends of February, and have a great week.